Hello, and welcome back to Ave Imperator Productions. Today we're going to continue our conversation from the first side. We were talking about strategy, and now it's time to start applying the basic tools that we learned to look at ancient civilizations and to attempt to build up the concept that we have. So, we're going to be taking a look at strategy in the context of ancient Egypt, and we can't obviously look at the entire history because it's so vast, but we're going to be looking at a very specific time, and before we can do that, I need to explain a couple of things. There are three basic divisions in ancient Egyptian history. They had the Old Kingdom, which was Dynasty 0 through 6, 1 through 6, depending on how you look at it. 0 would have been very mythical. And then between Dynasties 7 and 11, we had what was called the First Intermediary period. And then picking back up with Dynasty 12, we have the Middle Kingdom of Egypt. And this is where we're going to be concerned with strategy and with strategic thinking for this video. Now, the kingdoms of Egypt were the names for the specific times when the families and the native people of this country were in charge of their own land and their own fate. The intermediary period, the first one, which is the main topic of this video, was when various foreign influences, invaders, and petty nobles came to rise and to seize control of Egypt, therefore sort of rendering a fall in the overall civilization. Now, Egypt is very interesting because, especially in this first intermediary period, we see a lot of overall Western history being played out in about the same amount of time, but in a much smaller locale. So, the last king, Piopi, I think his name was, of the 6th dynasty, fell. He had been ruling for about 50 years, and when this happened, Egypt fell into disarray. Various different kings and different priests and different titled people came to rise and to rule their own sections. Various invaders came in, and Egypt began to look a lot like feudal Europe. Now, this is generally now thought of as a cause of a high centralized government falling, and the lesser nobles and different rulers coming up to carve out their own little slice of their country. But what's interesting about this is this was a recurring theme in ancient Egypt, and because of the Egyptian strategy and their way of presenting their culture and preserving their history, they could rise out of these intermediary periods and return to not the same form of centralized government and power structures, but something very similar and something moving forward. The king that we're going to be looking at that restored order in the 12th dynasty today was Ammenemes I. If I'm not saying these names right, let me know in the comments. It's kind of hard since they're all dead and nobody speaks Coptic anymore, but, gonna give it my best try. So, Ammenemes was a fantastic king who gave himself several titles through his reign and managed to bring Egypt back from the cusp of destruction. Now, in the intermediary period, there were, instead of, as we see in Europe, they called them dukes and barons and things like that, we give the names to these lesser nobles and these lesser rulers of nomarch. The different nomarchs would rule the different sections, and they would use various religious influences to reinforce their thought and their ability. And I'm going to put forward the idea that this was all a very strategic and a very planned out way of the country collapsing so that Egypt itself would maintain its integrity and wait for its next true king to arise. Now, why would Egypt have these constant intermediary periods, invasions, and wars to deal with? Egypt was materially very wealthy. this was the early Stone Age leading into the Bronze and Iron Age, but even at these periods marked with higher metal use, stones were still very important. The various limestones and granites and semi-precious stones were valued all over the world, and Egypt was rich with a lot of this wealth. On the other hand, Egypt did not have the greatest military force. They did, of course, speak very highly of their own warriors and of their own victories in combat, but if you look at Egypt over the course of its history, it always kind of stayed in this one particular shape, which actually looks a lot like a lotus, which is very interesting and unique in its own, as it goes from Upper Egypt down to Lower Egypt and out into the Delta. But they never really expanded their influence all that far, which kind of shows that their military really wasn't up to par the way that a lot of others were. Now, I spoke in the previous video about coalitions, deception, and violence, and I said that the apes in their tribe, which were the most violent and the most capable of sustaining violence, were not always the alpha or the top. This is exactly the case in ancient Egypt and these ancient societies. Egypt may not have been the most able to inflict violence, but they were certainly at several points in time in the Old, the Middle, and even a little in the New Kingdom, the most impressive and the most influential of the nations in their area. Now, how did the Egyptian society manage to stay coherent through the first intermediary period so that a king like Ammenemes I could rise to power and resecure all of the Egyptian lands under one title again? It's very interesting, but I'm going to put forth the idea that it had a lot to do with their religious and artistic strategies as a civilization. So first, we're going to look at the religious strategies of Old and Middle Kingdom Egypt. The religious figures were very important in their society. They did a lot more than hold the records of the Egyptian religion. They were the people who could read and who could write. And to control history at that point in time, just like at any point in time in history, is a very powerful tool for the ruling class. Now, the thing about ancient Egypt is that they had several cults to different gods that were all sort of in competition. Whichever one could secure the favor of the current sitting pharaoh would gain privileges, the ability to not be taxed, the ability to run the temples of the gods and the past pharaohs, and the ability to preach in the main capital cities. In the first intermediary period, there was 3 or 4 main cults that were vying for power. These were in Thebes, in Memphis, in Hierakonpolis, and in Heliopolis in Upper Egypt. So it was very important to secure the blessings of these different groups, but if the nation was split and was warring with each other because of the necessary communications, because of how far one was from the other, it was very difficult for one nomarch or one lesser person to gain the influence and control of all of these religious cults in order to back themselves. So, when invaders would enter into Egypt, they could usually control one and maybe some other minor ones, but they definitely weren't going to get the blessing of every single Egyptian cult. And this is another very important concept that separates Egypt from a lot of the other civilizations that were in the more Levant area and the reaches of Western Asia. The Egyptian pantheon was very unique to itself. It wasn't until the Greeks came down under Alexander that a concept like Zeus, Ammon, Ra could come in and supplant the old Egyptian gods. So therefore, you had to assimilate into their culture. This was very special technique because it meant that the invaders couldn't bring their ideas in. They had to come in alone and then become part of the Egyptian ways and the Egyptian religion. Eventually, under the treatment of the priests, they would come to be more and more Egyptian themselves until it was really less of a contrast, and you couldn't really tell who the original invaders were. It was a very strong strategy for assimilating the foreign elements that may find their way down into Egypt and the Nile River. And again, I think that this was a part of their overall religious strategy. So, in the intermediary period, the first one, which is what we're looking at here, there were various nomarchs that were backed by the various cults. And they didn't really ever manage to go up the Nile and to venture into the other ones until Ammenemes could secure Lower Egypt and bring the whole of the nation back under his own control, and therefore the control of the pharaoh or the great house. I would also posit that this is one reason why Akhenaten would come in later, and he would try to replace the Egyptian deities with one single god, the sun disk. They weren't very kind to this idea, and after his death they attempted to forget him and to push past him. In my opinion, this is because if an invader or a foreign person came in and took over that one singular cult, they would become all-powerful, and they would have to do very little to bring the whole of the nation of Egypt to heel. In the various other nations in the West Asian area, the different cities all represented their own gods, but they could be subject to one another because they were all in very similar pantheons. Egypt did a lot to preserve its own culture and its own history, but they also were very motivated to move it forward. So at one point in time, Horus or Osiris or Ra or Ammon might have been the top god, but that was merely the cult that was garnering the most attention from the pharaoh. When one pharaoh would come in and unite all of these, he would still bring one above the others, because you had to have a certain element of control over the most intelligent sect of your people. Again, these were some of the very few people at this time who were reading and writing, so having people like that on your side would have been very important. Ammenemes came in mostly with the support of the Theban cult, and managed to unite all of these religious centers once again, and they generally had a more palatable taste for the nativist king, for the person who was attempting to secure Egypt for Egypt rather than for themselves. There was one dynasty in the intermediary period, either the 8th or the 9th, I believe, which had something like 70 kings in 10 years. Obviously, they didn't rule one right after the other. This is where the concept of the nomarch comes from. Most Egyptologists at this time believe that at this period, the 70 kings would have been at separate parts in the nation, garnering the favor of various different cults and attempting to unify their own concept, but kept running into the difficulty of bringing one cult over another. This, in my opinion, would have been the main strategy of the ancient Egyptian religion. Again, we're not going to look at the Book of the Dead or anything like that at this period. I just wanted to stress the fact that for 4,000 years, ancient Egypt remained isolated and remained in control of itself, even through these intermediary periods, and one major factor of this was their religion. So, to wrap up, I want to take a look at the strategy of the ancient Egyptian art and the way that they showed the might and the majesty and power of their civilization through not only their physical representations of art, but also through their spoken word and through their deeds. Now, ancient Egypt had a very conservative view on art, as I've spoken about before. It was much more a form of propaganda and sort of control than it was a function of individual artists attempting to express a perspective. The ancient Egyptians had a very unique culture in that not only was building and constructing new temples seen as a way of attaining glory and prestige for oneself, but the preservation and the functioning of the older temples was also seen as just as worthy of the cause. This was a problem that Rome would run into near the end of their civilization. There was more to be gained from building a new aqueduct than from maintaining the old. And this is one of the huge reasons why ancient Egypt managed to maintain itself for such a long time. Now, it wouldn't be fair to say that Egypt was a society that was constantly looking backwards, in that the Middle Period kingdoms were attempting to be exactly like the Old Period kingdoms, but they did have very much of a sense of duty to the past in order to continue to move towards the future. A lot of people see the pyramids and they think of them as simply being sort of funerary sites, and this really isn't true. They were temples, and they were places where certain activities, certain cults, and certain rites were practiced and maintained through the ages to remind the Egyptians of where they had come from, their ancestors, and the ever-present necessity of death in the cycle of life. So, in order to maintain their kingdom, they not only had to build new temples and new sites for their own funerary purposes, but they also had to maintain the old. The Egyptian Sphinx has actually been unburied from sand about 3 or 4 times over the course of its history. 3 of them were during the Egyptian period, and the final time was by Napoleon and his crew when they went down to Egypt in the 19th century. The Egyptian artistic style was very much a function of minimizing the traits of the actual kings and the actual pharaohs in order to maximize the qualities and the necessities of their leaders in a more abstract way. They were all portrayed very similarly, and this was to show that they were all a reincarnation of a specific god. They would become Osiris when they died so that they could continue to make the sun rise and continue to make the crops grow. And this was very necessary for the runnings of the kingdom, and it also helped to give a reason to the peasantry and the lower classes as to why they needed their pharaoh and why he was particularly important. It goes a little bit beyond this. The kings themselves would have these various names. Ammenemes actually had about 3 names, and they weren't the way that names function today. They had a Horus name and a given name. Their name would normally be a string of words that meant something important, but wasn't necessarily what they had actually done so much as what they wanted to have done or the goal that they wished to have seen. Some of the examples of these names would be Good, Lord of the First Start, King of Upper and Lower Egypt, and Pacifier of 2 lands. Now, Upper and Lower Egypt refers to the distinction between the flow of the Nile goes from south to north, so when we say Upper Egypt, we're actually talking about the southern part, and when we say Lower Egypt, we're actually talking about the northern part. Gotta remember, they didn't have compasses or maps the same way that we do, so their whole life revolved around the way that the Nile worked and its flow. But some of these kings, especially in the intermediary period, that called themselves King of 2 lands, King of Lower and Upper Egypt, and then the king preceding Ammenemes, who called himself Good, Lord of the First Start, weren't those things. Ammenemes was the one who solidified the kingdom, so the previous king, who called himself the Lord of the First Start, was more attempting to portray with his name the fact that that was the goal, that was what he wanted. It wasn't what he got, but it was the idea that he had in mind for Egypt and for his great house. And real quick, before we wrap up, I want to talk about the pyramids and the temples and the way that they progressed. Now, we know that just about all of the major pyramids are from the Old Kingdom, and they began to go in a different direction with the Middle and the New Kingdoms. This may suggest that they no longer had the ability to construct these large pyramids, such as the Grand Pyramid at Giza, but it's actually a lot more interesting than that. In the Middle Ages, this massive spire was constructed for the cathedral at Ulm, and yet we don't say that the cathedral at Ulm was the greatest, most beautiful, or most artistically innovative cathedral in all of Christendom. Similarly, the pyramid at Giza, while it is very large, was not the most complex, nor the most beautiful, nor the most artistically driven of the various religious sects. And it was more a symbol of the heights that the Old Kingdom had gotten to. But even within the Old Kingdom, they had moved from building up and up and up to building more complex. They started building smaller pyramids with red granite and with finely inlaid stones that were much more skillful. And as the Middle Kingdom came about, they did a very good job of maintaining the old pyramids, yet they moved more toward a temple with a post and lintel and with a carving into sort of rock faces and various areas like this. Ammenemes, even though he was the returner of the great kingdoms of Egypt, did not necessarily build a grand pyramid for himself. He built a new style of temple. This ensured that the old ways were preserved, and yet the culture continued to move forward and to progress with its ideas and its artistic styles. This preservation of history, while also looking to the future and making successful innovation, was a hallmark of Egyptian quality and was overall a strategy to not only keep the kingdom together, but to maintain the integrity of the Egyptian people and the Egyptian state. So, thank you very much for watching this episode. This is the end of the first part in our talk on strategy. Next time, we're obviously going to take a look at the Greeks. It's going to be a very interesting episode, a lot more in-depth, because they did start to really blossom the concept of strategy, and we're going to have a lot more words and concepts and people to work with. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a like. If there's anything that you want to see, or any concepts that you don't understand or anything like that, feel free to leave a comment. I respond just about all of them. If you want to see more content like this, make sure to subscribe. And we're going to continue with these. There's going to be probably about 6 episodes on this, and then we'll go to another topic. If you want more art, if you want more history, feel free to let me know about any of that. So, until next time, remember, Ave Imperator.